All right, it's my enormous pleasure to welcome to Bad Faith Podcast for the first time Professor Quinn Slobodian. He is a professor of international history at Boston University and the author of a number of books, most recently Hayek's Bastards, Race, Gold, IQ, and the Capitalism of the Far Right. Welcome to Bad Faith Podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So I not only had an opportunity to get into your book, but to also listen to a number of other interviews you've done most recently on the book. And I have come to the conclusion in my prep this morning that I would like this to differ from those insofar it's more of an applied Slobodian.
Okay.
And the way that we talk about applied math or other applied sciences. Yep. That I want to start, obviously, with a conversation about your ideas, but then to talk about them more specifically in the context of our current political moment. We had a guest maybe a month or so ago, Anita Say-Chan, who had written this book, Predatory Data,
right.
that subtitled Eugenics and Big Tech and Our Fight for an Independent Future, which engages with some of the similar ideas about why it is that there is this growing interest, ever present, but it seems exponentially growing interest among far-right movements in what we call sort of race science, skull measuring, phrenology, the kind of things that we sort of thought that Stephen Jay Gould had put to bed in the 90s, but which are becoming more popular, even entering the realm of pop music with Kanye's extremely unnerving latest hit, Heil Hitler. This is how mainstream this stuff is becoming. And its embeddedness within the tech community in particular raises this question of how the tech giants that have inarguably bought the Trump administration and in a lot of ways are running our country is benefited from that kind of pseudo race science. So maybe we should start there. How is it that big tech is benefited from this movement? Why do you think that we're seeing this resurgence now?
Well, I'm sure this is something you got into with your other guest, and I don't know if you've ever interviewed Malcolm Harris, but he wrote this great book, Palo Alto, about the history of eugenic thought in the Valley and at Stanford in particular. So there is a good century now of thinking in the greater Bay Area about new forms of breeding, new forms of ranking people, and specifically how the mind can be both modeled and then ordinally assembled into a kind of a hierarchy into which you can plug, certain minds into certain parts of the circuitry based on their utility. So the long story of tech is about the analogizing of the mind to a computer in certain ways. And one of the stories I tell in my book is the rise of this idea of the information economy or the knowledge economy in the 1990s. In the midst of the first dot-com boom. And in a way, we never left that. I mean, the US economy continues to be defined by the wealth and fortunes of a pretty small number of huge tech companies. And with that, I think has been brought a kind of new understanding of human hierarchy and human superiority and inferiority, which ranks people according to their usefulness for the machine. I mean, for lack of a better way of putting it. And IQ becomes the kind of generic way to talk about the utility of the human brain for the functioning and onward expansion of a computer-driven digital capitalism.
There is an argument that I think has a lot of traction, particularly on the left, that says something like, the nature of capitalism is that there is this excess labor force that you have to do something with or rationalize away. So having a racially pluralistic society where you have a subcomponent, a very neat 10% in America of the population that has historically been African American, that can be blamed for their own downward mobility, regardless of slavery, regardless of Jim Crow, creates a narrative that says, it's not that capitalism is that bad, it's never going to happen to you, it's going to happen to this racialized other. You tell a story in your book about how that emerged as a necessity as we moved from a sort of imperial context, empire, to a more democratic context. And this was a tidbit that felt very kind of new to me, and which had useful explanatory value. that in empire, when you have complete and total domination, you can simply, you don't have to explain yourself. You can course correct, fight it fiscally by implementing policies that are very detrimental to the masses to stabilize gold, et cetera, the value of gold, et cetera. But once you have democracy, suddenly you can get kicked out of office if you do things that are too detrimental to the interests of the working masses. Yep. Can you get into that a little bit in a little bit more detail? Because to me, that it deepens this sort of, I think, accurate, but in some ways easily dismissible by people who don't care that much about race, argument about the role that race particularly has played historically in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of reflects one of the ways that I try to understand the ideology of the far right and the ideology of neoliberalism in general, both in this book and in my previous other couple books on the topic. And that is to think about it in terms of dialogic combat with opponents. So I think what neoliberalism is at any given time is often defined, or I would say always defined, in terms of what it sees to be the primary threat to capitalist stability. And the book I wrote 2 books ago is called Globalists, and it put together the end of empire with the birth of neoliberalism, which probably wouldn't always line up in most people's minds because it would seem like 2 different stories. Like on the one hand, the history of decolonization, and then on the other hand, the triumph of a certain set of ideas about organizing the market. But my point in that book was actually that by the 1960s and 70s, the high point of decolonization, when you had a host of new African and Asian independent nations entering the world stage, taking up seats at the United Nations, exercising what they saw as their right to economic self-determination, there was a real fear that this was going to wreak havoc with all kinds of investor security, free trade arrangements, the right to own property over borders. So much of what we think of as the institutional architecture of neoliberalism, whether it's bilateral investment treaties or ultimately things like the World Trade Organization, the structural adjustment policies of the IMF and the World Bank, were actually emerging out of this attempt to keep the genie of economic democracy in the bottle and to make sure that new decolonized nations, many of which were, led by African and Asian non-white political leaders, wouldn't become an unruly force that would, throw the world of interdependence and the international division of labor into chaos. So in that earlier work, I'd already been interested in the way that there were these economic threats that were frequently seen as racialized threats because of what they were seen as the threat they posed to the totality or the smooth functioning of the whole. In the question of money, and this gets to the last chapter of my book that you just invoked about gold, there is a longer history about the supposed golden age of economic interconnection in the late 19th century up to the First World War that historians actually call the first age of globalization, because you had with telegraphs, with steamships, with falling transport costs, you would have one world market for a commodity. So if you're sitting in Hamburg, you're actually setting the global price for a particular commodity, or sitting in London. And you had the world knitted together by the gold standard, meaning currencies were pegged to gold at a set rate for decades at a time. And nations were really committed, and empires were really committed to upholding that parity, and would do so by liquidating workers when necessary, driving down wages when necessary, destroying organized labor when necessary to make sure that inflation didn't, make the currency float from the gold peg. So it was partially in that case racialized, but also just very much a class fear. It was about fear of the workers with a voice. And after the expansion of suffrage after the First World War and the emergence of mass democracy, at least for men, and then eventually for women in some countries between the wars and after the Second World War, and the ongoing struggles, obviously, for equal rights beyond that, it became less and less possible to keep currencies on gold. That didn't mean that the fantasy didn't remain. And that's the subject of that last chapter of my book. It's about these gold bugs who throughout had basically harbored what is definitely an anti-democratic and anti-emancipatory urge to return economies back to one-to-one gold parity that would definitely imply removing all forms of, social redistribution or social safety nets, and would disproportionately affect, obviously, those populations that have been historically less advantaged and been oppressed.
So would it be right to characterize the move away from gold and the sort of understanding that you can print money and spin into the economy with some limits, some inflationary limits, as ultimately advantageous to the American workforce, who now, since there is now a way to sort of influence the economy and deal with inflationary effects, et cetera, without simply using a tax on labor as a really blunt tool. And therefore, the implication of people, most famously, as you write, obviously, Alex Jones, and the Trump figures who very openly and cravenly will sell gold and be involved in these commercials and things, suggest to me that is moving concomitantly along with a retrenchment of the democracy. That is the risk, right? The risk of having that blunt instrument of being anti-labor when you are on a gold standard suggests that if you are trying to move people back in that direction, this is an anti-democratic project. And in fact, Mark Andreessen and others who we talked about in the episode with Anita Say-Chan are very open about their anti-democratic instincts. This is fascinating in the current political context where, of course, the right post-Trump has been defined by this sort of right populist movement. We on the left obviously are characterizing this as a sort of faux populism, but there's some interesting bedfellows that now exist with the Steve Bannons of the world who are openly advocating for taxing the rich, something that Donald Trump has talked about recently. You can decide for yourself or reserve judgment as to whether or not that's going to be an argument made in good faith. Alongside these tech billionaires who are saying, we don't really care about populism. The people are going to be ground up as meat or put in front of screens or
biodiesel.
Who cares? Biodiesel, exactly. And who really cares?
Yeah.
What have you made about this? Made of this sort of dissonant union between these two camps within the Democratic Party right now? The Republican Party right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point you started with is really important, right? Which is that, and it's something I'm trying to get across in the book, that we don't talk enough about the capitalism of the far right. And we also don't take into account the fact that debates about money, for example, are never just about money. When you talk about money, you're bringing with it all kinds of political implications and social implications. And what you were saying is exactly right, which is that the expansion of the Great Society programs of the 1960s, the expansion of what even the US state, not exactly known for its welfarism, was willing to cover, though, in terms of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid for the average American citizen, is one of the reasons that people cite for why the US went off its own gold standard in 1971. So it was this kind of double whammy of expenditure, the Vietnam War and overseas foreign expenditures, but then also domestic expenditures on social programs. So when the US moved from a gold standard of its own in 1971 to what you would call like fully fiat currency, in which the only thing backing the currency is people's confidence in the Fed, basically, to, prop up the currency and bail out the currency when need be, then for a lot of conservatives and neoliberals, this was kind of a fatal moment because you had taken the reins off, you had taken the leash off, and now democracy could run wild because the population could just ask for stuff and the government could just make the money printer go burr to satisfy their demands. And in the 1970s, that's indeed the kind of crucible of neoconservatism when people put those two things together. Melinda Cooper has written very well about this. When things like, no-fault divorce, single motherhood, promiscuity, libertinism were all seen as partially both produced by this new loose money environment and then also increasing the loose money environment because supposedly now the government has to step in and fund all of the bad decisions that people have made, pursuing pleasure. So now you have to pay for all of these single moms with their kids, which is why, conservatives have always been disproportionately focused on what are actually really small, like rounding errors in the US budget to do with, for example, the support for dependent mothers, because with mothers of dependent children, because it's seen as like the Achilles heel of a complex that mixes morality with money issues. So the desire to roll back, public spending isn't just a question of frugality or discipline in the abstract or austerity understood outside of all social repercussions. It's a core way to police certain kinds of social behavior, to draw certain hard lines about the ways people are allowed to live their lives, and to, force people, as with welfare reform, to, let's say, funnel money through the biological father to try to re-entrench like a heterosexual nuclear family, for example. So
then do yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I think it's a big topic that we don't talk enough about, because the far right is actually itself, you already intimated this, not united on this issue. And this is also true in Europe. So you have some parts of the far right who are actually like anti-austerity, and they're anti the idea that we should have hard rules on money creation. We should be able to have what people call welfare chauvinism. So, like welfare for citizens matched with punishment and exclusion for non-citizens. But then there are other parts of the far right that are actually even more focused on austerity. And the gold bugs that I talk about in my book are an example, where it's not just like, control the size of the money supply the way Milton Friedman might say, or like, don't operate through discretion, operate through a rule. But no, like shred most of what exists as liquidity and roll back to like a very primordial level of, the existence of money, which would then inevitably mean most people would die. Also, most of capitalism wouldn't work well. You wouldn't have debt and credit that we have now. Liquidity would dry right up. But it would be like this purge process where those, well prepared enough, well equipped enough would make it through, and those less fit would be finally culled. And there's that liquidationism at its extreme form that actually sits at the heart of a lot of the gold bug ideology. And you mentioned Alex Jones. Glenn Beck is someone else who used to hawk gold a lot. And that really kind of mask off like social Darwinist attitude. It's far from the idea of just a central banker trying to keep investment conditions hospitable. It's more about using money as a tool against, socially undesirable humans.
I think this is really important, it seems to me, because Glenn Beck, Alex Jones, people have been on the scene doing this since I was a child.
Decades. Oh yeah. Yeah.
So, but the sort of mainstream liberal narrative is that these people are sort of self-enriching and foolish and tacky and gross, which I don't disagree with.
Yeah.
But the motivation behind it, which is so much more pernicious and is such a longer game being played, hasn't been foregrounded in any way by like mainstream liberal media in a way that appreciates it for the threat that it really is, and creates enables us to put together a story that understands all of these different satellites orbiting around that are pushing the world in a certain direction. I'm so glad you brought up the social Darwinism of it all, because again, going back to the idea that there are these two nervous bedfellows in the Republican Party, uneasy bedfellows in the Republican Party, are reflected in these two phenomena. One is that the phenomenon that you just described of you called it what, deliquidization, that benefits basically only the very, very top, the tech elites that have bought our country, requires you to understand. It requires an acceptance of the fact that the overwhelming majority of people, including in a democracy, most of the people who voted to put these people in the power in the first place, are going to fare very badly. And as we've alluded to, some of the race story of America goes part of the way to make people feel comfortable with the idea that the bad things aren't going to happen to me, it's going to happen to other people, which of course is playing out in sort of fascinating ways as folks who voted for Trump in this last cycle are realizing that their friends and family and loved ones are getting deported and they thought it wasn't going to be me, or they're having to shut down their stores because of the tariff policies and prices rising, saying, oh gosh, I didn't think it was my small business that was going to be negatively impacted, et cetera. But seemingly anticipating that most people are going to be negatively impacted, there has been this sort of survival of the fittest Populist style narrative that is being deployed, which basically says, and I want you to elaborate, obviously you're going to say this much better than I could, that says that it acknowledges that it is natural for people not to want everyone to be poor and in the street. And that is something that this kind of techno-feudalist right, or whatever you want to call them, are going to have to contend with. That the state of nature says that we grew up in these, communities of primates in the savannah, and that we were collectivists, and that our survival required our dependence on the other, and that is ingrained in some primordial way in our heads.
Yeah.
And if the techno right is going to succeed, then they have to figure out a way to disavow us of this silly atavistic concern that we are a society, actually, that we are a community, actually, and that we should hold on to what are ultimately ideas about community that are holding us back from some technological or financial achievement that is beyond us.
Yeah, but I think that they can use the argument you made against us too. So the way that they would describe it, and the people in my book describe it, exactly as you say, that we have this hardwired savannah mentality, which is based on living in small groups, swapping things in a decommodified way, taking care of not our society, but in their terms, our tribe, right? So that we have the tribal mentality they think just locked in there. And the bad leftist movements, as they see it, try to revive that. So Hayek literally has a book called The Atavism of Social Justice, where he says, this desire for redistribution, fine, I get it, but it's because it's in our reptile brain, and we're just tapping into like this old instinct and old intuition. Society comes about by transcending that. So society we get to when we start treating each other actually anonymously. So we need to treat each other more like, service providers and people who can deliver us this or that good, objects that we can invest in and, withdraw services from at will. And so the tech libertarian mindset is, yes, partially, we need to make sure that the tribal communitarians don't rear their head again. But then they're also clever enough to say, or can we actually use that tribal instinct for our own purposes too? So can we use tribalism against society? And that's if you follow the work of someone like Balaji Srinivasan, who I actually spent a chapter on in my previous book, Crack Up Capitalism. This is exactly the argument he's making. He's saying that we actually, through the internet, are refinding others like ourselves. So we're recreating these kind of diasporas in reverse, where we didn't originate anywhere, but we're finding ourselves anew and creating these kind of digital homelands in our online affinitive communities. And somehow we should actually use those against existing society. So we can now create sort of privatized tribes and use them to exit and resist the demands being made to, pay taxes for someone I don't care about, who doesn't post the same way I do, who doesn't believe in the same things I do. So the reason I emphasize that twist is the reason the book is called Hayek's Bastards is Hayek himself, most famous for The Road to Serfdom, born in 1899, lives till 1992, so spans the 20th century, experienced 2 world wars in his early life, his early adult life. So he was all about just stitching back together like a market society. He was trying to keep the tribal instinct at bay as much as possible. It's that's all nationalism. I don't want any part of that. I want us all to just interact in the market and, create smooth, harmonious relationships that way. Discover each other not as familiars or equals, but as market agents. That's maybe not the best case scenario, but the least bad scenario that he can imagine. The people I'm talking about are bastards because they take his ideas, but then they kind of think about them differently. And so they actually, in many ways, invert the ideas he had. So if neoliberal ideology for 100 years was basically economic freedom first, let's create sets of laws so that people mostly see each other as market actors, and mostly democracy is kept within pretty strict limits. So you have counter-majoritarian things, you have all kinds of laws to prevent people from turning property into something that was collectively owned, expanding out how much the state should be involved in people's economic affairs. In the 1990s, Murray Rothbard, who's this person that I describe in the book, who's an anarcho-capitalist, is advising Pat Buchanan, 1992, in his run for president, our candidate for the Republican Party. And he says, look, Hayek has it wrong. Hayek thought that everyone had this instinct towards communism. And actually, by the 1990s, especially in the United States, he's like, nobody's a communist anymore. Like, there's no nascent working class here that's going to like seize the means of production. Like, the working class that exists in the United States has been weaned out of that union tradition, has been weaned out of those leftist ideological influences, and now they just want to like get theirs. They just want to like be the last one not holding the bag, intimations of the economy that we live in now. And so we can actually use the people against the elites, because the elites are the only ones who still believe in this equality stuff and social redistribution. So that's the moment what he calls right-wing populism or paleopopulism. But he says we can get to more intense libertarian outcomes, not by taking over the state and doing a bunch of programs, but by smashing up the state and then building something in the ruins. So it becomes a much more accelerated and intense social program that isn't just about like handing Margaret Thatcher like some new ideas for monetary policy, but more like stuff we've been seeing with Project 2025, very fittingly was in the hands of Elon Musk, who brought like the CEO founder mentality to the project, but hit a wall eventually, as we know. And now it's being taken over by Russ Vought, who was one of the authors of Project 2025, written by the Heritage Foundation, which is a core neoliberal think tank. And if you look at the proposals, it's like, oh, they're not just saying, shackle the state or reform it. They're actually figuring out ways to dismantle, what we would think of as fundamental parts of the state. So that's this post-Cold War accelerationist strain of neoliberal libertarian right-wing thinking kind of uniting on a project that to us, is quite startling. If you haven't been watching it coming, you'd be like, what are they up to? Why would they want to remove state capacity instead of using it for their own ends? I think people like Bannon, who claims to be, a rearguard national conservative trying to reindustrialize the United States, is in the minority at this point. I don't think there is a lot of that.
Well, that's what I was exactly going to pivot to, was to ask, what then do you make of, on one hand, vilifying the child having and the welfare queen in the 90s.
Yeah.
To now the JD Vance saying, oh, actually, it's good to have a child tax credit. We're not going to call ours that, but here's $5,000, proposed plan to give $5,000 to Americans for having children. It's obviously mixed up with the race science insofar as the language around this movement and the trad wife movement and all of this is geared toward certain kinds of babies being born and certain kinds of families being born.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's certainly not being proposed as only white families get $5,000. So there does seem to be some kind of acceptance of the reality that the others will benefit as well. So what do you make of that wing of the party going full steam ahead with at least purporting to support a kind of populism, along with Steve Bannon and another example talking about raising taxes on the rich?
Yeah, I mean, I think purporting to support is the way to put it, right? Because in the same way that the tariff policy seems to be purporting to support, the return of manufacturing to the United States, and yet is using only the stick of tariffs without the carrot of industrial policy. Therefore, to me, is just it's a masquerade, actually, of reindustrialization. I think this is performing for their posters and their followers. I think that until I see actually these pro-natalist policies getting turned into law, then I just assume them to be propaganda and just late campaigning material. Secondly, it's really hard to do pro-natalist policy, right? And we actually have years and years and years of evidence about the attempts to get the birth rate back up in places like South Korea, Japan, Hungary, Poland, France, even more recently, Denmark. These places have all done, in some cases, very expensive, like we're talking a couple percentage of GDP that places like Poland and Hungary are spending on quite generous pro-natalist policies with very little outcomes. So actually, the fact is, we know it doesn't work. We know that we can't actually move the needle because giving people $5,000 when their kid is born is going to cover like, a few months of daycare. So I would say a couple of things there. One is the only real option for keeping the population from shrinking is immigration, and that's the real question is, why is that not on the table? Why does it need to be blood lines of this country being reproduced instead of the much more obvious answer, which is, oh, well, what do you need? I mean, the world's full of people. Why don't you bring some here? The second is, one of the things that I find frustrating about the talk about trade policy or reindustrialization, as well as supposed interest in the current Republican Party for the care economy, is like, actually, there was a party that was very seriously trying to do this. It was called the Democratic Party under Biden. It wasn't that long ago. Like, actually, the IRA was about precisely this. Like, how can you do at scale, politically, indistinguishing projects of large-scale structural transformation with the care economy and union jobs at the heart of them. So if they're so devoted to that, then maybe they should be doing more of an autopsy on the IRA instead of, just repeating right-wing talking points from Orban.
I want to come back to the question of the Democratic Party. What I think you've accurately described as one of the better aspects of the Biden administration, but also their failure in sort of rhetorically filling that kind of void, or really challenging the Democratic Party. I keep doing that. Mm-hmm. The Republican Party to follow through on its purported commitments here. But first, I want to come back to something you just said. I mean, the question of why not just allow more immigration, and this is something you talk about in the book.
Yeah.
Of course, the response is going to be they're not the right kind of people, and part of this sort of tech-driven worldview has to do, really leans in on these arguments about sort of essential characteristics, inheritable characteristics, or if not inherited, formed in the early years of your life such that you can't really be socialized out of, characteristics that make you suitable to a certain kind of society. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, no, and I think it's worthwhile telling these genealogies because, a couple points back, you said that, people talk about Alex Jones and Glenn Beck as just like grifters, self-dealers or something. Or I think they just talk about them as, merchants of hate or, voices of racism or white supremacy or whatever, all of which might be true. But the point of my book actually was to say, what if all of these things that are often just described in affective or emotional terms also have an economic reasoning on their own terms internally? So what is it that what does it mean to say, buy these gold coins, other than just, I want a commission on them? Well, it actually says something about the kind of social order that you envision reestablishing. What does it mean to say, like, IQ is important and real? When did that come back on the agenda? Why, for example, did the Maritime Academy urge a book that was criticizing the bell curve, but leave the bell curve in the library, which I find really interesting and symptomatic. And I think that, what I talk about in the book, especially with this intellectual history of the bell curve, written by Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein, 1994, big bestseller, was on the New York Times list for 10 months. He was represented by one of the big New York agents. So this wasn't actually, stuff just circulating on alt-right websites.
Yeah, it wasn't fringe.
Yeah, it wasn't fringe. This was part of the mainstream conversation. So why was it? What were people getting out of it? Why were they picking it up at the bookstore and buying it? I mean, my answer is that there was a kind of fatigue, middle brow, I guess, fatigue. He's thinking about the book buying public with the what had been by then 30 years of the civil rights movement. I mean, you had for 30 years people speaking a language of social justice, equality, the need for the state to take an active role in racial uplift to make life, better for Black people, more similar in terms of life chances, educational opportunities. And after 30 years, it seems that the book buying public was agreeing that like we were sick of that. That now it was time, as Murray and Herrnstein said, to start, quote unquote, living with inequality. It's never going to change. It's actually never going to change because it's part of people's genes. They say this, by the way, with no genetic data of any kind in the book. There was not and still is not like strong genetic arguments that can be made about these kind of things. There's all kinds of correlations and inferences and blah, blah, blah. But the idea, and this is why you mentioned a second ago, the idea of going back to nature. That's kind of the point of my book too, is like, when in doubt, the right will just sort of say, there's no argument to be had here. This isn't a social question. It's not a political question. It's just that nature and science say it is so. And this is the hammer blow to your demands for egalitarianism or social change. And in the 90s, there's this perfect storm of, there is new genetic data. The Human Genome Project finishes up in the late 90s. There's a new rising prestige of things like neuroscience and pop science as giving us this, we know this from like NPR programs and stuff, right? Like, did you know the hidden secret why we can't do this or that? Why we can't like lose weight or get off our phones? It's always something about behavioral psychology, behavioral economics. So that discourse was really ramping up then too. And, there was this feeling that you could accept small numbers of people at the right-hand side of the bell curve. They could be brought into the corporate boards and Harvard or whatever. And then the left-hand side of the bell curve might just need to be warehoused. And maybe mass incarceration is not a coincidence, but it's just an acceptance of hardwired realities. Furthermore, once you accept this new seemingly scientific ordinal ranking of humans according to their intelligence, you've got a ready-made cheat sheet for immigration policy. So Charles Murray quite literally says, well, we can't generalize about every individual because people can be anywhere on that bell curve. But if we want to just have a rule of thumb, then yes, we should take more immigrants from, on average, higher IQ national groups and be more discriminating and exclusionary to those groups that are further down on the hierarchy. And there's a very concrete example of that being deployed politically. In the German case, I studied Germany. I spent a lot of time in Germany. And there was this one book that was kind of like the bell curve of the 2010s that really gave the intellectual justification for the Alternative for Germany party. And if you look at the way he's arguing it, why is he saying people from Muslim majority countries should not come to Germany? He's not saying because they are, Muslim infidel or heretics that are going to dilute, Western Christian civilization. He's referring to a bunch of bad science and saying they have high time preference. They're not able to control their impulses. They don't have entrepreneurial skills, and we have the psychology to prove it. So science says they should stay out, not racism. And that attitude, I think, it's been very useful to mainstream a lot of far right, especially anti-immigrant politics, as being based not on bad feelings in people's hearts, but good data on the page. And that's a frightening development, I think, and one that I could see definitely continuing in the near future.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point with immigration, but then also with respect to just domestic policy, if you believe that inequities in education or employment or mass incarceration or, police violence or whatever it is are attributable to immutable characteristics and not, 400 years of slavery or socioeconomics or anything like that, then the government's responsibility to have any curative policy programs evaporates.
Vanishes. Yeah. Well, and
so
you can see, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, and there's very concrete examples. So the Department of Education has not been around for 100 years, right? It's only created in the early 1980s to do stuff like this, to do educational testing, to do early child interventions, to make sure that kids have heard the same number of words, et cetera, and to like start the early process. This is all specifically, nurture-driven policy ideas that the left, the mainstream psychology establishment has been pushing on for decades and decades, if not longer. So to say, among other things, we're nuking the Department of Education is also just to say, like, we're going to the bell curve, like we're doing living with inequality. The fact that the Smithsonian Museum of American Art was just criticized heavily for its recent exhibition for denying the biological realities of race, I'm sure you heard about this, is just kind of like, saying the quiet part pretty loud. And the new policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, similarly, if you remove this idea of preventative care and early intervention and policies that have been proven to work, like vaccination for easily transmitted childhood diseases, then actually all you're going to do is take those existing structural inequalities you mentioned and just supercharge them. Like you're just going to take the pre-existing conditions at the broadest sense that so many people suffer from and just make those even more determinative of life chances. And then guess what? You have more evidence for your own idea that it's all natural and it was going to turn out that way anyway.
Yeah, and this is why I have become increasingly uneasy with some of the critiques of wokeness that come from the left. And certainly I understand there are some excesses and certainly some things I wouldn't defend. But there has been a very concerted effort to target ways of understanding the world in a sociological context, whether it's in a legal sociological context like critical race theory, whether it's discussion of a colonial or post-colonial lens. And the right has come after that stuff specifically saying, well, if you understand the world in terms of oppressors, you're going to see everything in a progressive way that's bad for us. So let's attack that way of looking at the world in particular. Let's frame any use of the word colonial as woke, as though colonialism didn't happen, and as if there aren't downstream effects from hundreds of years of people not having self-determination, and on and on and on. And so I understand, like, I do see some factions of the left sort of buying into the idea that using that kind of language is like akin to, chuggy land acknowledgements or something like that. I don't have feelings about land acknowledgements, but that it's similarly sort of a superficial thing as opposed to something that goes to the core of how we've been able to convert the youth in large numbers to seeing the world in a more progressive way. And why the youth in larger numbers are able to see, for example, Israel and its occupation in ways that older generations haven't, for example. And it concerns me that there is a willingness to sort of write off sociology departments when it's obvious to me that the work of sociology departments and historians of science like Stephen Jay Gould, et cetera, have done so much to get the culture to a place where it once understood Charles Murray as the noxious entity that he is. And now we're having completely mainstreamed Hail Hitler pop songs. Well, I don't want to say it was completely mainstreamed. They didn't platform it, but whatever. Precisely because I think we've been stripped of our ability to understand the world, the language that we used to use to push back on what used to be, mainstream. These kind of skull measuring science. We moved through physiognomy and craniometry and all these other kinds of things through psychology with its flaws. But it seems like the retrenchment is is going hand in hand with the attack on certain academic disciplines.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's long been obvious to me, actually, that the anti-woke left was just carrying water for being useful idiots for the Chris Rufos of the right. I mean, it's actually been extremely obvious to me. And partially it's been obvious because of, I think, a different story that I think I try to tell in Hayek's Bastards, but that I would propose we think about for the last 35 years. So if you think about the end of the Second World, or the Cold War, the big capitalism versus communism Titanic clash was over. And so what happened in the 90s? What happened to questions of racial diversity? What happened to challenges of gender equity? What happened to environmentalism in the 90s and 2000s? Well, there's a pretty common narrative on the left, which says, we had the time of what Nancy Fraser calls progressive neoliberalism. So capitalism did win. That did have a world historical triumph. And to placate, the embers and remnants of the social movements of the 60s and 70s and even 80s, it threw tokenistic bones to parts of those social movements. So you could have, a little more melanin in the boardroom, and you could have eventually, offset credits for your flight to Europe for the summer, and you could have Sheryl Sandberg style lean in corporate culture, celebrating a certain kind of identity politics, but within an extremely narrow, commodified frame. I think there was a lot of people on the left that saw all that happening and rightfully were critical of it. We're just like, this is defanging the potential of proper forms of critique. This is, absorbing the important energy that could and should be going elsewhere and turning it into a way to prop up all of the forms of accumulation that we should be spending all of our time targeting. And I agree, all that was happening. But what's interesting, and what I point out in my book, is there were people on the right, both conservatives and neoliberals, who from the jump, from the moment that the Berlin Wall fell, felt the exact opposite. They were very concerned about the inverse happening in what I just described. They thought that it was possible that these new social movements had actually completed a long march through the institutions behind the backs of mainstream society. They had seized all kinds of important roles in specifically things like the Department of Education, let alone higher ed, the press, even they would say finance. And they were going to use what looked like capitalist institutions as a Trojan horse to roll out their environmentalism, their grand forms of, gender erasure, their forms of the demolition of the nuclear family. And that would happen through the European Union. That would happen through certainly the university. It would happen through things like the United Nations.
If only.
It's like total crackpot stuff. But, among other people who were promoting this idea in the 1990s, the Vatican. So the Vatican in 1995 unites actually warring parts of the Catholic Church that range from traditionalists to more liberal, people in global North countries around the fear that there is a new primary enemy. It is basically the new Satan, and it's called gender ideology. And it is a culture of death, and it treats sex as something that is totally individualistic and voluntary, and it treats life as disposable, hence the opposition to reproductive rights. It's being rolled out by humanitarian organizations. It's being rolled out by international organizations like the UN. When they looked at the big conference of women in Durban or in Beijing, they were like, look, here it is, it's happening. And a lot of the stuff that gets circulated, like in CPAC, from Orban to Bolsonaro to Vance, that's what it is, right? It's a conspiracy theory about the left and the progressives having actually secretly won the Cold War, outlived the Soviet Union, and having colonized all of the core institutions of civil society, which is what has been mobilizing them and freaking them out for the last 20, 35 years. And they are now, in their minds, achieving this like meta political victory of finally, taking down the Columbias and taking down the Harvards, taking down the National Endowment for the Humanities, these small budget lines in the US budget. Why do they care about them? Because they see them as places where the progressives have dug in and are, injecting the poison of their ideas of social justice. So actually, they've been afraid about what they call wokeism for 35 years. They called it victimology. They call it political correctness.
Right.
They called it all these other things. They said that communism had gone from red to green. And if you're on the left and you look at this situation and you see your role as like also piling on, I'd be like, you're right, there are too many. Like, then I just don't get it. Like you've misread the grain of struggle.
I mean, I think you said it right. What there is to get is that there was, I think, a robust and genuine, and I share in this, frustration with liberals, the Democratic Party, the neoliberal Democratic Party, over subscribing to identity politics precisely because they weren't the thing that the Republicans feared or the conservatives feared. They weren't actually willing to take these institutions and do substantive material advancements for these various interest groups on any kind of economic metric.
Of course.
And that we wanted them to do that. And so we needed to call out the fiction that they were in order to remedy the situation. So that's part of what makes the arguments that are happening now on the left so difficult. Because J.D. Vance is saying, these are Marxist institutions. I've never had a professor in my life that identified as a Marxist. Meanwhile, the Harvards and the Chicagos of the world, their business schools are literally training up and exporting, deporting maybe soon enough, but exporting all over the world right-wing economic thinking that is then being used to infiltrate and influence the economic structure of various countries all over the world. Look at a Malay, scratch a Malay and find someone who attended Booth. I don't know anything about Malay's educational background. I'm just saying as a framework.
He's a home trained. He went to the university in Argentina. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So, but this is the problem. So I want to bring us back to the Democrats, the broad left. What to do about all of this now? You mentioned accurately that there were, in the wake of COVID and a kind of shock doctrine for the left sort of a way, a more populist economic program that we saw under Biden than we have in recent history in the Democratic Party. Of course, those programs were designed to lapse, I think, in a very politically inauspicious way, right before an election, and people were feeling the pain of that. They remember the loss of that support rather than the support itself, and that was in part contributed to the Biden and Harris loss. But we've talked about neoliberalism a lot. We have declined to actually define neoliberalism. The left uses it as a way to distinguish itself in some ways, and to distinguish its priorities from the priorities of the Democratic Party. Someone who's coming to this conversation and listening to all of this, and who still has this question of understanding, why? What I wrote this question down as, why is a neoliberal not a liberal? And it sounds very Alice in Wonderland, like, why is a raven like a writing desk? But this I was actually out with someone over the weekend, an economist actually, and he asked me, like, well, define neoliberal. And I was like, oh, Lord, this is too high stakes for someone who's a liberal economist.
How long you got?
So I'm asking, right. I'm asking you, I basically I walked him through the sort of, I'm pointing at my bookshelf, sorry, the Thomas Frank trajectory of listen liberal, and, the liberals abandoning a certain kind of pro-worker economic project in, the 90s and third way and all of that. But I want to hear your take as we wrap here on, the left is directionless in many ways post Bernie and certainly post this last election. How would you talk to someone about what the sort of negative aspects of why they should have concerns about neoliberalism and what we should be aspiring toward as a left going forward?
Sure. So I have a kind of like auto disclaimer that I use to talk about neoliberalism whenever it comes up, for those great moments at the bar, as you just described, when someone's like, what is it? And so it basically goes like this. And I think that it's too much to say that there's one definition that we could all unite around. I think that it gets used in very diverse, promiscuous ways. But I would say that usually in about 4 ways. And I think we could start by saying, like, which of these 4 ways are we talking about? Because they're quite different. They have their own literatures. They have their own bookshelves. You could have 4 bookshelves of each. One is to talk about it as a period of time. So people will say, like, when did neoliberalism begin? Like, was it with the abandonment of the gold standard? Was it with the election of Reagan and Thatcher? And so it's a way of thinking about the global history as having these time spans, like social democracy followed by neoliberalism. And then the question becomes, like, is it over? Is it dead? So that's like a period of time. Another way it gets described is just as like a policy package, right? So there's like the 10-point list of the Washington Consensus, like deregulation, liberalization, privatization. So then you could actually make a kind of checklist and you could say like, is, Argentina neoliberal? Well, check, 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 this, that, not this, strangely, or whatever. Thirdly, people will talk about it as like a way of thinking about themselves, right? Like, why am I working on a Saturday? I'm so neoliberal, right? Like just a kind of way of self-exploitation or internalizing certain kind of ideas of competitiveness, and usually like self-profiling and like branding, trying to push yourself out into the market, make yourself into a commodity. This is like Michel Foucault's idea of being an entrepreneur of the self. Then there's a fourth definition. This is actually the way I use it, which is a really specific intellectual movement. So Hayek, the name on the cover of the book, he gets together with some people in 1938 in Paris and says, we need to refound liberalism. This is a perilous time. We have fascists, we have communists, we have planners of all types. We need to think of this as a neoliberalism, and they've coined the term there. We need to think about how the state can protect markets, maybe create new ones, especially in a time of mass democracy when, as we talked about with the gold standard, there's always chances that people will ask for things that will push the market off of its rails and will not prioritize economic freedom the way we would like to. So neoliberalism from the 30s to the present is also like this ongoing conversation among a pretty limited group of intellectuals about what fixes capitalism needs to defend itself against democracy in any given time. And there's different arguments. So this runs through the James Buchanan stuff that like Nancy MacLean has written about, which is like redesign the Constitution and make sure that it is like, preventing disruptions coming from democracy. Or it can be like the Milton Friedman stuff, like make sure that central bankers operate by a certain set of rules. Or it can be more like the Gary Becker stuff, like let's think about every decision people makes as something motivated by maximization and profit, and design institutions so that there's more markets everywhere we look, carbon markets and things like that. So there's, first of all, taking the big topic of neoliberalism and narrowing it down to like, what if we just look at these people who called themselves neoliberals and think of it the same way we would the history of liberalism, where you'd look at Locke and you look at Keynes. If we look at it that way, then we find the answer changes from decade to decade. Like, how should capitalism survive this decade? Does it need to make sure that post-colonial countries don't like break the harness and start nationalizing all of their like oil fields and their coal mines? Does it need to focus on making sure the European Union isn't becoming too socialist by doing things like leading the Brexit vote? And so the very Thatcherites who were into the European project in 1975 are now against it in 2015 and in 2016 because they have changed their mind about what they see the European Union being. Neoliberals now are of two minds. Some are totally against Trump. Charles Murray is one of them. He's a never Trumper. He is the F.A. Hayek Emeritus Chair of Cultural Studies, and he doesn't believe that Trump's the way to go. So they would say we need more business friendly, we need more like a Mitt Romney style technocrat. Then there's other neoliberals who have happily joined the Trump project. So think about like a Vivek Ramaswamy, describes himself as a Hayek guy. When he met Millet, I have this in my conclusion, he said, I'm a Hayek guy. You, Javier Millet, are a Mises guy, Ludwig von Mises, Hayek's teacher. And Millet said, no, I'm more of a Rothbard guy. So I'm more of the anarcho-capitalist guy. So this is not, I don't have to do big leaps of interpretation here, right? It's not like looking at, someone driving a car and saying, that's a neoliberal person. Why are they driving a car instead of taking a bus? I'm talking about like specific set of references, cortex that has a set of pretty defined debates. And for me, I'm like super narrow in the way I use it. Like that's how I use neoliberal. It's like talking about this crew.
The uniting thread, though, between all of those various neoliberals you just described, correct me if I'm wrong, this is what jumps out at me. The idea that you have to defend capital against democracy. They have to defend markets against democracy. That strikes me in a very sort of like rah-rah flag waving, yes, I'm an American sort of way, as so antithetical to our self-concept. The idea that we have to revise the Constitution to protect the document that's supposed to protect the interests of the people, to protect the interests of markets. A document written by founding fathers who were very conscious of the risks that corporations posed to democracy, seems to me to be such a fertile ground for pushback if there existed a major left party that was willing to resist neoliberalism.
Yep.
The problem is we don't have that.
No, not at the moment. No. I mean, we're not post-Bernie, right? Man's still alive. He's still breathing.
That's very optimistic of you. But I mean, this is the critique of the left, at least, my corner of the left, is that we had the best high hopes for Bernie. I obviously worked for the Bernie 2020 campaign. But in the post-campaign landscape, we have this kind of sheepdogging happening, where ultimately Bernie Sanders, after he is no longer running for office or national office himself, isn't going to call out the neoliberalism of the Democratic Party, or at least not do so in a way that would ever imperil its electoral chances, then what are you actually doing other than shoring up the neoliberal project?
Well, I mean, defending it from even deeper political threats from the right, I suppose. I mean, I guess that's the only defense of it, right? So I think that's maybe what I'm trying to do with my work is like shine a spotlight on that curious and slightly very volatile, but also unpredictable fact that for the last couple of decades, people who have been mostly interested in economic freedom have been actually working together with, going arm in arm with people who have other interests. So the Alternative for Germany party, you might, all you know about it is like it's German nationalist, yes, but it's also people who are like critical of the euro, want to go back to the Deutschmark, want to have better monetary management, working expressly in partnership with people who are more interested in like blood and soil and pro-natalism. And that was a conscious choice. They said, like, we can actually both get something we want out of this, which is exactly what the MAGA project is, right? It's people who might be mostly interested in getting like the only first term legislative accomplishment, which was the 2017 tax cut. They want to get those made permanent. Does that mean they're going to swallow some things that are even like wildly disruptive tariff policy for the last month? Yes, it does, actually.
I mean, my concern is that to the extent that Democrats are able to win again because the backlash against the more excessive aspects of the Trump first 20 days, 100 days, God knows what's going to happen next. It's because they can trust Democrats not to repeal the 2017 tax cuts the same way Joe Biden didn't for the 4 years that he was in office.
Oh, yeah.
And so to me, what the history that you've so vividly drawn for us, the portrait that you've drawn for us, is one in which the right has been able to exploit the inconsistencies and the emptiness, frankly, of the left neoliberal project, the Democratic,
the progressive neoliberal,
exactly, to make claims about how dangerous it is. Look, there's all of the downside of being woke without the upside, right? There's all the downside of saying we're going to do redistribution and race politics and all of those kinds of things because they're coming for your jobs without any of the upside of, we actually made your life better.
Actually do that, yeah.
And so what do you, my concern is, and this is the battle that's happening on the left, and obviously people can disagree, but the concern is that by enabling and emboldening and protecting the Democratic Party so it can fight one more battle, what you're ultimately doing is continuing to create the conditions for the rise of all of the AfD and the Donald Trumps and the Malays and all of these right-wing actors. And the only real antidote to it seems on a global scale right now, is the Claudia Scheinbaums and the actual like left populism, where we're going to do some redistributive politics. And until we have some kind of hard line in the United States of America, God help us what the next version of this down the transom is going to be, what the J.D. Vance administration is going to look like when it's not so bungling and haphazard as Donald Trump, America's greatest comedian, that took a wrong step and ended up the president of the United States when he should have just been hosting the Wendy Williams show.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only hope, and it's a kind of a crazy hope to have, is that if, as Jonathan Hopkins, the political scientist, has suggested, politics now isn't about left and right, it's about system and anti-system. That if we have, as we do, I think, an anti-system government in charge, if they progress as far as they might indeed progress to destroy the system as it exists, then that normal push and pull in which they can just rail against the establishment might be reset, and there might be, an opening to create something new. I mean, it's not lost on me that as someone who was socialized in the late 90s, being critical of things like the WTO, as with, Senator Sanders himself, that the person who has succeeded in breaking up the world trading system that has reproduced so much inequality is someone from the right. That is actually, as some people have suggested, not to be sneezed at and to be treated as an opening, with all kinds of unpredictability and potential downside risk and so on. But it is an opening. So if there's one thing.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if there's one thing like the politics of the last decade has shown us, looking all over the world, is like nothing is certain, like everything is open and open for radical redefinition. So I think it's too early for, fatalism.
Yeah, I'm certainly not advocating for fatalism either.
Yeah.
And another example, in addition to the WTO example, is that, again, I don't want to give any praise before things are finalized, but what's looking like Trump showing a lot more muscle and willingness to go around Israel and negotiate with Hamas for hostage release and also some kind of end to this genocide in a way that Joe Biden wasn't willing to do. So what does happen? I mean, how can the left even start to make these arguments in favor of the lesser of two evilism of the Democratic Party when there are some really big ticket items that may emerge where the Democratic Party is not, in fact, the lesser evil? And I think you don't have to wait for future examples. You can go back and look at things like welfare reform and mass incarceration and make an argument that a Democrat can do it, a Republican cannot, because a Democrat does not face the same resistance that usually comes from its own base because of this sort of protectionist instinct among liberals. I mean, I have come to the conclusion that the white moderate, in the words of MLK, is the greatest obstacle. And another word for the white moderate is simply the liberal, which comes in all of these different colors. There's a fight happening on Twitter right now because people are mad at David Hogg for, DNC vice chair, for being critical of Clyburn. And the response from so many Black liberals is, how dare you criticize this man who is from oversees one of the poorest districts in America, has done absolutely nothing for them, has worked with conservatives to redistrict to make more white Republican districts because it shores up his Black majority in his own district and entrenches his own power, who takes more money from the pharmaceutical industry than anybody else in Congress, but he's Black. Therefore, and he's, an elder. So therefore, how dare David Hogg challenge his reign? This is the Democratic Party that we live in right now. And it's just really not clear to me. That's an understatement of the year. I very much do not agree that preserving it is going to do anything other than sort of grease the runway for more bad things to come. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, as with all these things, you mentioned Scheinbaum, but I think it's always a good moment to become even more of an internationalist, right? Like when this duopoly, as we suffer under in the United States, has become more suffocating perhaps than ever, is to point out places like Spain, for example, where they do have a left-wing government, where they're doing really interesting things with creating more worker ownership of corporate boards and, pushing for all kinds of more decentralized control of housing policy. Actually, Germany's had some really interesting stuff, pushes to nationalize private developers under constitutional rules that, have been getting very close. So I think, it's always a good time to look around the rest of the world and see how this maelstrom of America can sometimes distract more than focus the mind.
Well, do you see, let me ask you this. Do you see a world in which the American Democratic Party chooses to go that route rather than lose? Because there's an argument, again, when you look back to this past election, that the writing was on the wall that Gaza was going to be, if not dispositive, very influential in the outcome of the election. And a choice was made not to shift policy and to lose, not even to lie about it in the short term. Well, yes, we were supporting a ceasefire and then just not do it. I mean, obviously I don't advocate that, but they wouldn't even lie about it in the short term to win an election. Or, to see the off-ramp that I believe the Bernie campaigns were to shore up confidence in the Democratic Party and that they would rather lose than take those off-ramps.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there was definitely an opportunity lost. I don't know if Gaza was the defining issue, but certainly for more left-wing populist messaging that she basically all but abandoned for the democracy talk in the final stretch of the campaign, whether under the influence of her, brother-in-law formerly of Uber, or
Tony
other
West.
things. So I think, there was a chance there to see what, if anyone would be persuaded by anti-system politics from inside the system, there was certainly possibility for a lot more riding. The argument that something like the IRA, which we discussed, was something that could not be accomplished in 4 years or a portion of that, and that the business cycle that had kept inflation up from the COVID pandemic was something that was not permanent and was going to subside as indeed it has. So I don't know. I'm not, this is not my wheelhouse, but I do think that it's helpful to get this historical perspective we've been talking about for the last hour to understand that the last couple decades for the right has been a discussion about first principles. And they're literally talking about, like, what did we bring from the savannah? How can we build satellites in a metaphorical sense? What will we build in ground zero the day after what we see as social order may be collapsing? In its perverse way, this is kind of an inspiration, I think, for the left to just not get too trapped in the kind of triangulation mode, but figure out, like, okay, what is it we actually want in the grandest sense?
Well, we know what that looks like. What the neoliberal left's response to all of this is.
The savannah.
It's abundance. No.
Oh.
It's abundance discourse. That's what the big brains in the Democratic Party have decided we need to combat all of what you've just described.
Yeah. Meanwhile, so Abundance is number one bestseller. The Technological Republic, Alexander Karp, himself a Democrat, is number one. What's not number one is, for example, like Chris Hughes's book, Market Crafters, that tells like a complicated story about 150 years of trying to use the state for progressive purposes in the United States. It's just too complicated. People don't want it. They want a one-liner, and that's where people are at. They want a bedtime story.
Well, look, I agree and I don't agree. I said this to Anita Seychan too, because I really got a lot from both of your books.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I am a professional podcaster whose job it is to sit around and parse academic books.
Right.
And as much ire as podcasters get, I do think our benefit could be, and when we're at our best, is to do the also I'm a comms person, but to do the translation work. And so I wrote to her after. I was like, I want you to write an article and I want you to focus on, I want you to. I think it would benefit you. I'm sorry, I don't sound patronizing, but I think the world needs these ideas. Here's how I think it could be useful in article form and short form in a magazine like Current Affairs. And these are the points that people need to know and connect them to real world. And that's why I said I wanted to do a kind of applied Hayek's Bastards, because it's closing the loop. It's connecting. People have these instincts, and the right has done a really good job of giving people a narrative that makes sense of their instincts about the way the world is unfair. And the left and the Bernie campaign, I think, did a very good job of that in terms of sort of the social safety net policies and what we deserve and why we don't have them, and sort of the corruption oligarchy narrative. But now there's so many other pieces that are in play, including the way that race, science, and IQ are mobilizing people, the natalist movement, understanding things of how, the global tools that manage the global economy, both legal tools and the IMF and the World Bank, are superseding governments, and the flip-flop between being a corporatist who is very invested in domestic national rules that are beneficial, but then they were not beneficial, leaning on international rules and having the ability to flip-flop, exert pressure on governments not to prioritize democracy, not to prioritize the needs of the people. How all of that is working together helps us to understand why the bad aspects of what life is like today and late-stage capitalism are so pernicious and seemingly inescapable.
Yeah.
And so that's a long way of me to say thank you for writing it.
You're welcome.
And thank you for coming on and helping me with the project of sharing it even further with the world. Can you tell the audience where they can find more of you and your book on the internet and beyond?
I have a website, quinnslobodian.com. I seem to be perpetually doing these YouTubes and podcasts and stuff. So there's no, I think, ending of Slobo content out there for those who are hungry for it.
Excellent. Thank you again, Quinn. Thanks to all of you listening to this episode. You know you can get an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast every Monday at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. and a free clip of said premium episode over on Bad Faith YouTube. The algorithm is kicking our butt, so don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification button over there on YouTube. Thanks again for all of your support to the patrons. As always, take care of yourselves and keep the faith.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.